Good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to the penultimate session for today. We have two speakers. They're both excellent, and we're going to be talking about transport and logistics and modernising that particular or those particular supply chains. As I'm sure other speakers have said already, improving the efficiency of supply chains is key to both domestic productivity growth and international competitiveness. While it is right, I think, to focus on roads, rails and ports, the complex regulatory environment must also be studied and improved at local, state, federal and international level. It must be fit for purpose. While it is often the case that better export supply chains will also facilitate domestic trade, that should not be taken for granted. Supply chains can and do compete with each other and collide with each other, meaning that domestic processes and end users must also be heard in this process. Setting that scene, this afternoon we'll hear from two speakers who are very much at the coalface when it comes to these issues, with deep knowledge and passion for domestic and international supply chains. First up, we have David Chalmers. David is a partner in the LEK Consulting Group and head of its agriculture practice. His firm has been extensively involved in the development of the Commonwealth Freight and Supply Chain Strategy, and he has recently authored an international grain supply chain benchmarking study as part of that strategy, and he'll provide us with an overview of that study and highlight areas where perhaps grain is performing well and where it can perform better. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Jeff. I'll share my screen and appreciate the introduction. Look, as Jeff mentioned, I'm head of our agribusiness practice, and if you haven't heard of LEK, we're a strategy consulting firm. And we do everything from strategy to operational improvement. And over the last couple of years, we've found ourselves doing a range of supply chain studies, particularly for the federal government. And we thank the team at Grain Trade Australia for their assistance during our recent projects. And as we heard in the last session, we're playing a role with government where we're really helping them educate on the nature of a range of different supply chains and what the priorities are. And where the opportunities to fix the supply chains exist. And doing these types of studies last year was particularly interesting, given the interesting distractions that we all had. But my observation is there's a much higher drive from government than I've seen previously to really understand those issues from an efficiency perspective and obviously from a resilience perspective through our experiences last year, and then to form an understanding of who has influence over which issues within a supply chain that in order to solve them. And sometimes that's government, sometimes that's industry, sometimes that's the peak bodies. There's a range of different levers to pull. And look, this presentation today is really a small snapshot of the work that we did last year, where we looked at a range of issues in the grain supply chain. And we did that by identifying the issues that were experienced locally, both in terms of our export supply chain and also within our domestic supply chain, and where they both overlap. And then went and did some benchmarking against the Canada and Ukraine in particular to highlight where those countries do things differently and where there's some opportunities to learn. And this work will culminate in a release of some data into the National Freight and Supply Chain Strategy onto the Data Hub, which will be released shortly. So I'll run us through some slides, and some of this will be very familiar to some of you and maybe not so much to others. We took a very top-down view of grain movement in the country. We looked at three archetypical supply chains. So we looked at the traditional supply chain, taking grain from the farm to an upcountry receival site, to a port, and then into an international port. We looked at the direct version of that supply chain where we skipped the upcountry receival site, and then we looked at the domestic supply chain and how that gets to the domestic feedlots and the domestic milling sites throughout the country. Along that supply chain, we looked at a range of different KPIs around where the issues exist. So the numbers down the side indicate where we've got KPIs, but the types of issues that we heard, and we did some rather extensive consultation with industry around what the issues were, but obviously the capacity of on-farm storage becomes limited, not necessarily a transport issue, but it is an important link in the chain. The issue around local roads, particularly upcountry, being in poor condition with the wrong load limits, creating issues and efficiency problems around those areas. The efficiency of upcountry receival sites, so the low throughput and low efficiency. That was a fairly large impact on the supply chain cost and efficiency that we observed. Through the longer road legs, particularly into port, there's issues around the NHVR and the permit processes associated with that, which differs by state. And obviously the experiences the issues that we've all experienced around the capacity of the road transport fleet. So as the harvest fluctuates up and down, do we have enough drivers? Do we have enough trucks? Are they in the right spots? The biggest issue of all was what we observed to be the underinvestment rather in rail assets, relatively low utilisation in parts, issues around network capacity and general efficiency. And then a range of issues at the ports in terms of excess port capacity and some problems around biosecurity regulation. And all of these stack up to having quite a significant cost impost on the supply chain. So we took benchmarks, and the benchmarks that we considered to be important are the obvious ones. Cost per tonne kilometre. What are the relative differences between the differences in distances between the nodes in the supply chain, and how does this all stack up? Now, we had a look at Ukraine and Canada, and the main reason we picked Ukraine and Canada, international benchmarking is obviously fraught given the different structural nature of the supply chains. But the reason that we picked Canada and Ukraine was, particularly with the Ukraine, we see as competing in international markets. This is an old chart, but a goodie in terms of the volume of wheat exports out of each of those markets. And Australia growing at about 2.5%, Canada growing at about 2.6%, and the Ukraine growing at 11.7% over the last 2 decades. And that level of growth has obviously changed international markets, but it's just an indication of what's happening in those supply chains as well. In terms of the structural differences that we see, this is just a schematic showing what happens in each supply chain. So in Australia, we have relatively low on-farm storage compared to Canada. We have relatively shorter rail distances than Canada. Obviously, Canada runs a monopoly rail link down to the port. It's very efficient. It's very long distance. The Ukraine's a bit choppier. There's more receival sites. There's a more interesting split between railroad and barges to move to port. They've got a lot more port terminals, but similar bulk and container movements out of the ports. But the point here is that there's some structural differences in each of these markets. So you need to have a look at the benchmarks with those in mind. In terms of the cost structure, and I'll draw your eyes probably to the 4 bars on the right-hand side of this chart, in terms of where the costs in the supply chain sit. For a delivered cost of a tonne of wheat into Indonesia, as an example, excluding the levies. So in Western Australia, all of the cost sits in the paddock, but then the supply chain costs are lower. Out of the East Coast, effectively, the supply chain costs are higher. With the Ukraine having the lowest paddock costs, but actually quite large supply chain costs, and some of that's got to do with the difficulty in moving grain around there, whereas Canada's supply chain costs were relatively small, particularly when you think about controlling that over a longer distance. Taking this sort of analysis a step further, and I've taken the numbers off this, but just think about the relativities. If you start with a cost of a tonne of grain in Australia on the left-hand side, and you walk across to the cost of a tonne of Canadian grain, the big deltas, Canada spends more on-farm storage because of the need to dry the grain more. That's not particularly interesting. Australian trucking is actually relatively cheaper than Canada. The distance that we need to move the grain in Canada is significantly longer, but the way in which we move it is relatively more efficient. So it's the orange bars which show where the lower cost in Canada is. So the rail operations are more efficient, and the port is more efficient as well. So there's lots of data to come illustrating these sorts of points at a more granular level in our report that gets released shortly. Then, if you look at at a very deep benchmarking level, green is the stronger performers on a particular metric, and orange or red is where the weaker performers are. So you can see across the Australian states there is some variance. Typically, New South Wales and Queensland are fairly similar, but we do well for on-farm storage. The Western Australian upcountry network is more efficient. The Australian rail transport costs per tonne kilometre are much less efficient than we see overseas, as are the ports, and we do have a safety rate down there, which is probably unfair to Australia, actually, because it's quite difficult to compare safety rates across countries because they're all using a different denominator. But this is sort of a very high-level view of where we see the inefficiencies and efficiencies compared to international markets. There's a range of other KPIs that you could go and collect along the supply chain that are instructive, but what we've endeavoured to do is try to really pull out the important ones that sit against the issues that we identified earlier. And apologies for the slightly dense slide that will come next, but we've made a range of, I think, recommendations and considerations that could be used to address the key issues in the supply chain. And importantly, down the right-hand side, there's the balance of influence. So, who's responsible for solving them? Is it a federal or a state or local government, or is it industry? And then what role does industry have to play in lobbying governments to make these changes? Now, in the interest of time, I won't drain this slide, but I think there's the key issues that I see that really need a closer attention and more input from particularly government. I think there's some spot fixes around the road network that can be done to improve the key bottlenecks that we've identified around the country. And that goes both at upcountry levels and also on the upcountry site to port legs. There's continued focus on consistency in heavy vehicle regulation and making sure that's as simple as possible. There's a range of improvements in the rail network that are pretty old and pretty hairy issues, but they're not going away, and it's getting worse as the infrastructure ages. And I think the final one that I'll call out is mainly there's something around the better planning of port infrastructure. There's a lot of asset duplication around the country, which is causing inefficiencies in any given harvest year, depending on which port the grain is coming out of. So there's a range of detailed recommendations here that will form part of our work. That'll all be published shortly. But I think Jeff, I might leave it there as a bit of a snapshot into our work. What I'd probably close on saying is the effort to benchmark supply chains, I think, is quite important. I think there's an ongoing need to keep the data live. I think there's an ongoing need to be aware of what's best practice overseas, because everything's moving so quickly and the pace at which things move is increasing. And I think we can continue learning from it. And I think this transparency is really important for all players in the market to be able to better inform their decision making, be it governments, industry, and across the board. So thanks, Jeff. Back to you.
Thank you, David. That was you've whet our appetite, I think, very much, and we'll be looking forward to reading your report. I suspect a lot of what's in there will be familiar to many of us, and it sort of comes back to this issue, which I think is going to be a perennial, and maybe we can discuss a bit later on. This issue around how you do coordinate across different supply chains, state, federal, local, government level, and is there a person or an agency that can sort of remove some of those roadblocks? Anyway, or rail blocks, port blocks. Well, maybe I'll call up Neil, and then we can maybe have a conversation after Neil has spoken. So Neil will be familiar to many of you. He has a lifetime of involvement in transport, both globally and domestically, and he's currently Director of Container Transport Alliance Australia, a strong commercial industry alliance. Maybe we need some more of those. Organisation dedicated to the container transport logistics industry in Australia in particular. So over to you, Neil.
Jeff, and here I am in the graveyard shift before the finalisation of the seminar today. GTA asked me to take you through some of the challenges in the global container logistics chain, particularly where are the pain points, what's been happening during the COVID pandemic, and of course, what are the impacts on containerised grain exports, all in 15 minutes. So everybody strap in for a wild ride as we go through what's been going on, particularly over the last year during the pandemic. So what I'd like to cover particularly is this global supply-demand impacts of COVID-19, the issue of shipping line capacity supply and the demand for freight. But to begin with, I'll take you back probably a decade or so with global shipping line consolidation. So it's good to understand where we were before, where we are now in terms of the dominance of a smaller number of international container shipping lines, and the impacts that have had over the last year of the COVID pandemic. I'll talk about the impact on freight rates. I'll talk about congestion, but I'll take people through the empty container story, really. It's been dominated by an import surge, a surplus of empty containers in Australia, and you might be thinking, how does that impact on containerised exports? But it does have many impacts, particularly around availability of equipment, availability of capacity on ships for exports, and a whole range of other logistics issues that are disruptors at the moment and are continuing. So that's what I'll take everyone through today. So let's go back, if you like, a decade and talk about the global market share of the three dominant shipping alliances now. And many of the shipping company names will be familiar to those who export out of Australia. So we have the 2M Alliance, the Ocean Alliance, and the Alliance. And a take home from this slide is that those three alliances of around 8 major shipping lines control 80% of global trade. Now, that's a vast difference from over a decade or so ago, particularly before the global financial crisis in the late noughties, where the top 10 carriers were probably less than 70% of global world trade. So the consolidation, both in terms of the size of individual shipping lines and the consortia in which they're in, is really dominating what's been going on in the last year and will continue into the future. All those names are familiar from the Australian perspective. You could add in also Hyundai Merchant Marine, Taiwanese line, and of course the Israeli line Zim, which has started a service again to and from Australia under the Gold Star brand. So there's been a range of mergers and acquisitions over the last decade. Maersk, of course, took over Hamburg Sud. You've got the Chinese lines coming together, COSCO, China Shipping, and now, of course, OOCL based out of Hong Kong. And the one alliance, of course, with the Japanese lines coming together into that one entity. So mergers and acquisitions and the arrangements of their consortia and how they're sharing vessel services and providing those services is a big issue to take consideration of. The other aspect too is that, and this is a supply aspect, previously around the time of global financial crisis, the order book for new ships being built for many of the container shipping lines was about 60% of global fleet capacity. Now it's about 10%. So the shipping lines have realised that if they hold capacity and don't flood the market with shipping line capacity, they're going to control freight rates from their perspective much more effectively. So that's something to really take account of. Briefly to what happened during COVID is we had a series of phases if we look at it from the Australian perspective. The first was that when the pandemic first started in Wuhan, we had a slowdown in the Chinese manufacturing and markets as they went into lockdown in many of the Chinese cities. That started to impact on global supply and demand. We thought at that point in time, okay, this is going to be interesting. World trade may come to a crashing halt like it did during the financial crisis. And so the shipping lines responded accordingly by starting to blank sailings or take capacity out of the marketplace. Of course, the second phase was then the Chinese economy started to recover. They addressed COVID in whatever manner, and the factories went back to work. They started to pump out capacity again. At the same time, Australia was going into lockdown, particularly in where I'm from in Victoria, with quite a lengthy period of time for that lockdown. Again, the shipping lines responded accordingly by controlling capacity very strongly, taking ships out of the loops where they didn't feel that they were going to be full to capacity. So that was a real impact. And then, of course, the opposite happened to what everyone thought was going to happen. And from about mid last year, it just exploded. And we now are in unprecedented territory in terms of particularly the import surge, which has been occurring. So we've all been sitting in lockdown, a lot of discretionary spend, not able to travel overseas, not able to go out to restaurants, sitting looking at our couch saying, gee, I need a new couch, or gee, I need to do some house renovations, or gee, I need some other household item. And of course, all of that has to be imported into the country. And that's where this explosion has occurred in relation to imports. And the next couple of slides, I'll start to show the impact of that in relation to the shipping lines and their profitability and the like. The other aspect of what's going on in the international shipping industry is that the ships are getting bigger. And this is a slide taken from Port Botany, year-to-date container vessel visits into Port Botany. So we'll use this as an example. So the current size of ship, which is really the workhorse, if you like, of trade to and from Australia and New Zealand, is in that sort of 4,000 to 6,000 20-foot equivalent units or TEU capacity for the vessel. You can see that, year-to-date in 2021, in Sydney, about 130 and 199 of those ship arrivals in 2021 compared to previously. But of course, we're starting to see a growth in the even bigger ships, so the 8,000 through to 10,000 TEU range. And that's where the future is. So from a capacity and supply point of view, it means that there are fewer vessels arriving with larger capacity, and you get the tsunami effect or the surge with a lot of imports being discharged and a lot of exports having to be uploaded, be that empty containers for repositioning overseas or full exports. And that is another way in which the shipping lines, if you like, are balancing supply against demand, and that will be an ongoing trend. It creates real difficulties for ports in Australia, particularly a port like the Port of Melbourne, which is the biggest container port in Australia, and the capacity to be able to handle ships of that size. They will struggle eventually to get up the Yarra River under the Westgate Bridge and into Swanson Dock. And whilst we've been getting ships of around that 9,500 TEU size up the river and into Swanson Dock, there will come a time where once we're over that and we get to the next stage of vessel size, that will be more difficult. They'll need to be serviced outside the heads of the Yarra River in the case of Melbourne as an example. The other thing to say about the order book that I mentioned before is that most of the ships now being built in the world, container ships, are 14,000 TEU capacity and above. There's very little in that range that is now servicing Australia's needs. That 4,000 to 5,000 to 6,000 TEU are now 8,000 to 10,000 TEU. They're all the bigger ships. It's going to create quite a challenge for Australia into the future. So, of course, this has meant an impact on freight rates. This is just a quick snapshot of the Shanghai Containerized Freight Index. If we look at the blue line, and you can see that from mid last year, when shipping lines got smart in terms of controlling capacity, the freight rates have gone through the roof, both in relation to imports, but I'm sure that those grain exporters that are joining us today would have seen that phenomenon with northbound freight rates also rising. Looking at it from the ocean carrier's point of view, and this is an interesting slide in that the average operating margins of the ocean carriers have been hugely volatile over the last couple of decades. So you look at the left-hand side of the chart during the financial crisis, the share, again, as I said, of the top 10 shipping lines in the world was only around 70% of the capacity. They really tanked out in terms of their operating margins. They recovered into 2010 onwards. And you can see it's been quite volatile, where they've gone into the negative range on many occasions and then crept into the positive range. You then got that mergers and acquisitions wave that I spoke about previously. And you get to the point now where it's just taken off and headed northwards in terms of their profitability. The shipping lines have never been as profitable as they are now. And that seems to be a continuing trend, at least during this current surge that we're experiencing. Let me just take you through this empty container issue. And this is a bit of a busy slide. Again, this is from Port Botany. And it looks at what we call the load discharge ratio. So many would have read that one of the phenomenons that we've been having to experience, particularly because of the import surge, is the amount of surplus empty containers in Australia, which is the exact opposite of what is occurring in other parts of the world, particularly in Asia, where they're screaming out for empty containers. They can't satisfy the demand, particularly for the transatlantic trades to America, European trades and the like. So there's been this real imbalance. The difficulty we've had in Australia is just this huge amount of empty containers. If you add up the bottom line, which is, if you're looking at the pink, that's the surplus number of containers when you total up all of the imports brought in full and empty, all the exports in that month full and empty, what have you got left? The pink is the surplus. And as it said, over the last 6 months, it's in excess of 12,000 20-foot equivalent units surplus. And if you look over the life of the journey a bit further back, we got up towards 70,000 20-foot equivalent units surplus in Australia, just in New South Wales. That replicated itself too in the biggest port, Melbourne, and also in Brisbane, to a lesser extent in Fremantle and Adelaide. What does this mean from a container export point of view? Well, it's just a huge congestion in the supply chain, particularly with transport companies. Their yards completely chockers with empty containers and being unable to de-hire those containers, leading to space constraints in terms of handling both their export clients and also their full import clients. The imports aren't reducing. Melbourne, for example, is up about 28% on the same time last year and about 10 or 11% year to date. Sydney is the same, 30% up on the same time last year and about 6 to 7% up year to date in terms of imports. Trying to get an understanding of whether this is the new normal or not. In pork botany, of course, when you analyse this later, you'll see that the exports have been pretty static and, in fact, probably quite lacklustre in terms of exports, down about 1.3% compared to February last year and down about 11% year to date. Different story in Melbourne with full exports up 16% compared to February last year. And again, that's mainly because of the grain and stock feed exports being a big contributor to that. So I tell that story around the empties because it does have an impact that I'll now talk about in relation to export containers. So that's just a pictorial evidence of the congestion which occurred in empty container parks. That's DP World Logistics, Port Botany, Parks 1 and 2. They've got 2 parks. And, you know, it's a near maps snapshot. You can just see how congested and operationally difficult the management of empty containers were just from that picture. Very difficult to move around, very difficult to pull out the boxes that you need, you know, particularly say for export and the like, just because of the congestion and the additional lifts and the additional cost. So my last slide's really around berth congestion and this impact on containerisation for export. So what we also had to deal with and are still dealing with to an extent is from mid last year, the ships were well off window because of the pandemic effect, because of blank sailings and other things that have been implemented by the shipping lines. But we also had industrial relations disputes at the various terminals in Australia. And so time on berth and the ability to berth in all of our major capital city ports, it became really, really difficult. Vessels were certainly off window, as I said, and vessel rotations, the shipping lines started making rotational changes to their schedules to try and avoid congestion, be it in Sydney particularly or in other ports. And of course, that has a huge impact on export receivables, which not too many, unless you're in the supply chain, really understand. That all of a sudden you'd have, for example, a ship brought forward to rotate to Melbourne instead of Sydney first before Sydney. All of a sudden, export receivables are on for that vessel. Sometimes in retrospect, which I've hardly ever seen in my lifetime before, and exporters then scrambling to pack out for that particular ship if they've got orders that are going out on that ship, or the opposite, the vessel rotating away and being delayed, and the terminal's making a decision. Well, we were receiving for that ship, but now we're suspending that. And, you know, I had examples of our alliance companies with trucks already loaded with grain and hay and other commodity exports that from the night before, all bets are off for receival for that ship that day. So then you've got to find storage for those containers, or you've got to, you know, double handle or triple handle the containers and put them somewhere and load out the next lot that you need for the ship that will be receiving. So it's a huge impost on the land side. And I would say one thing is the shipping lines and the terminals aren't giving enough notice about all of this. And we understand the reasons for the rotations and the like, but they've got to have an understanding of the flow-on effect to the land side. The other phenomenon is that the shipping lines started to want to evacuate as many of these containers away from Australia as possible. We were screaming out for that because of the congestion. But again, probably one of the only times in my career that I've started to see shipping lines favouring taking export empties away from ports and rolling or not uploading full exports. I mean, what a crazy world we're in if that starts to occur. But the shipping lines are making a determination. I'd much rather get those exports empties back overseas to Asia, where I can load them out with a high yield cargo to go to, you know, to the United States or somewhere else. The other catch-22 that both terminals and the shipping lines were in is that the ships have berthing windows. They have capacity caps in the contracts between stevedores and shipping lines. So, for example, they might have 3,500 TEU exchange cap. If you've got this surge in imports and you're discharging a vastly more imports, in your cap, you've got less opportunity to upload exports, be they full or empty. And the shipping lines were then trying to negotiate with the stevedores to say, well, we want the ship to stay alongside, say, for an extra 24 hours, and for you to relax the cap and for us to upload, say, an extra 1,500 TEU of empties or other exports. But of course, that's more time on the berth, and many the stevedores then had a discussion with their shipping line customers to say, well, no, we can't do that because that will then cause more berth congestion for our other shipping line clients whose ships are due tomorrow. So it's been a real catch-22 situation that the stevedores and the shipping lines have been trying to work through. Equipment availability, you'd think with this surplus of containers that we have in Australia, that equipment availability of the right type, food grade, etc., or reefer, if we're talking about reefer commodities or refrigerated commodities, would be available. Well, it's still not the case, and I'm sure that there's many who are listening to this webinar today who have still experienced that problem of availability of the right equipment type at the right port, particularly for food grade. And the other aspect of all of this, apart from increasing freight rates, ocean freight rates, is the high terminal access fees. And I noticed in David's presentation previously that high terminal access fees or high fees, port fees generally in Australia is well above that comparison he had with Canada. It's a problem that we think needs to be continued to be addressed, and governments need to look very clearly at this because it's unregulated, it's unfettered at this point in time, and is causing much more concern around the actual cost to ship export commodities particularly. So thank you very much, Jeff. I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks, mate.
Thank you, Neil. Fascinating as always. I think we have some time now, don't we, for questions for David and Neil. So structural shift towards 40-foot containers, Neil. What's the impact?
Yeah, I probably should have put a slide up on that. And if people want to go and look at a slide, the ACCC monitoring report on container logistics, not the last two, but the ones probably 3 years ago, that they had a good slide in there. The Australian experience and the world experience is that we've certainly passed over equilibrium in terms of the number of 40-foot containers compared to 20-foot containers in the world fleet. And it's roughly around sort of 67% 40s now and 33% 20s, and particularly 40-foot high cube. So the shippers on this webinar would be saying, well, 40-foot high cube's no good for my grain exports. But I think that is a growing trend. It's going to be much more difficult in the future to have the right type of 20-foot equipment, particularly clean and food quality and newer, because simply the scarcity of 20-footers in the system. So there's people on this webinar who have more experience than me, but they're going to have to start to adapt to the use of 40-foot containers into the future, it would be my view.
Thanks, Neil. Any questions for David? I've got a question for David. I'm going to prioritise the floor over me. The Productivity Commission is undertaking a review of vulnerable supply chains but have excluded ag. Do you consider that the container situation just described should be recognised as a vulnerability for the Australian grains industry, is the question, I think, for Neil, or possibly for David as well.
Well, I'm happy to say we're putting in a submission as in some of the other shipper organisations. Yes, the productivity report is quite short in its time frame. So they looked at imports first, and they're now looking at exports. So it was very much a broad brush, but I think it's imperative that we do get the messages across around the vulnerability, particularly for commodity exports, of both high cost and the dominance of foreign shipping lines. Obviously, we're at the beck and call of others in the supply chain, which makes our supply chains for export particularly quite vulnerable to these types of shocks that we've experienced with the pandemic and any other shock in the global supply chain that might occur in the future.
And I can build on that, Neil. I've observed there's a number of different government agencies, and I don't know which ones are public and which ones are private, so I won't name names, but there is a range of different prioritisation activities going on in terms of which supply chains are the most vulnerable, which deserve. I think there was $105 million in the most recent federal budget to help with vulnerable supply chains, but the very, very obvious ones are being looked at first. Things like med tech and pharma. I believe agricultural chemicals is in there as well, but I haven't seen containers anywhere. So I think the concern here is that we're going to be very interested in supply chain resilience probably for the next couple of years, and then and as the effects of the pandemic wear off, it will reduce in everyone's eyes. So I think getting in that priority list ASAP is the priority.
What we've looked at is that in the United States, for example, they have what's called the Federal Maritime Commission, which is a statutory authority of the United States government, which does regulate a lot of the shipping activities, both domestic and international. Now, we don't have a body like that in Australia. We have the ACCC, but the ACCC's powers under the Competition and Consumer Act are relatively limited. But there is growing call for an organisation similar to that. Now, whether those powers are vested in an organisation like the ACCC, and maybe that comes along with what we call Part 10 or the Old Trade Practices Act, now the Competition and Consumer Law, exemptions for container shipping to collude, the need to possibly repeal that part of the Act, but come along with a block exemption arrangement similar to Europe or New Zealand or parts of Asia, and try to build in some aspects of proper regulation over how this whole supply chain works and the vulnerability of it from a containerisation point of view.
Thanks, Neil. I've got a quick question for David before we maybe go to the last panel session, which is, in doing your analysis, and it'll be fascinating to see your report, there's, as I sort of indicated in my introductory words, there's a Western Australian export grain supply chain, there's an East Coast export supply chain, there's a domestic grain supply chain. So there's at least three relevant grain supply chains, let alone the different modes that are involved. Was that a challenge so far as your analysis was concerned?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's the depth of analysis is always a challenge, and in a world of finite budget and finite time, it's what level do you go to get a meaningful insight for the industry? So where are the big issues and what can actually be solved, as opposed to there's a pothole on one side road up country which is causing problems. So how do we get that balance? So yeah, it's absolutely an issue, but having done this type of analysis over a number of different supply chains, not just grain, and some outside of ag, the level of data that we have, in particular the grain supply chain, is really good. So you can actually pick a level that you go to in terms of the granularity, and then the challenge becomes, well, how much information can we get out of international countries, and what level can we go to there based on the contacts that we have and the data that's published in those types of markets. So it's absolutely a challenge, but I think part of the reason that these are important to do at a national level is so that we can get a national answer, because there isn't that much money to go around. So we better be careful of where we put it.
Thanks, David.
We'll throw it across to you, Pat, and obviously other people on the panel here at the moment can also jump in as well, of course. The question really is, there's been a lot of discussion today around different concepts that can would appear to add a lot of value to the supply chain. So we've talked about technology and grain assessment. We've talked about grain standards. We've talked about supporting that with IT. And obviously behind these projects, there's also a number of other projects that GTA has promoted through its modernising the supply chain strategy. The question is there one of the projects, one of the streams that's more important than the others, or is it more of a 1 + 1 = 3 process? Do we need to try and move them all together forward in conjunction, or do we start with one and then have the others follow?
No favourite children question, Tim.
Yes, that's it.
So I think there'll be bits of it that one will follow the other, but I think where we're at right now, and also to the point about working with the government, is that there is some what's the word, momentum perhaps around the storage site accreditation process, and that's in a large part. I think we heard from David Ironside about where they're trying to do, and they're trying to. They realise that in 10 years' time, their approach to regulating the industry and grain inspections and so forth can't be what's happening today. And so they are really looking to the future around that and working on that. So there's some momentum there, and I think there's natural synergies there. And I think part of the answer to that 10 years time question for the department is technology, in that we, again, can't be doing things the same way we're doing, but recognising that technology and some of the stuff that Rob Martin showed us, it's happening, obviously. So I tend to think that the technology piece will come, and when we started thinking about this grain supply chain strategy as issues were emerging out of committees and so forth, one of the things it just said to me is, oh my God, what happens if 5 or 10 years' time we look back and we as an industry, not individual companies, but as an industry, haven't gotten on the train, so to speak. And, then we'll be going, whose fault is that? Sort of thing. And so that's where I see, we'll start with the storage site stuff. The technology needs to come. It's there, and trying to coordinate that across industry for those, limited first mover advantages that I talked about earlier this morning. I think we've got to work at an industry level to make sure that we don't get left behind.
I guess that's the point, Pat, in the sense that industry and business will, in many respects, drive the change and the improvements that are needed. But an ongoing dialogue with the government at all levels is really important, particularly from a supply chain perspective, because they ultimately are the people who can erect or remove roadblocks and impediments.
It's a nice segue also, Jeff, into a question that we didn't ask before, which was someone had with regards to inland rail, and it's probably for you, David Chalmers. The question was just with your study, it was noticed that you had a comment in there about inland rail and perhaps some opportunities to leverage it. Certainly from a GTA perspective, we've attempted to do that with the Inland Rail Group, but we really haven't got any traction, and grain just doesn't seem to be on their radar. I just wondered if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, look, it's interesting. I mean, grain isn't necessarily the first priority benefit of inland rail, but I'll tell you what, there's some definite opportunities that we've observed, particularly for some domestic supply chains as well. So I'm not sure I can help how you get leverage, Tim, with that group, but I think it's a worthy cause to keep pushing on, because the benefits are pretty clear to me.
Tim, there is a question in the Q&A in reference to the statement that first adopters were quickly losing their advantage. How real do you think this is a disincentive to innovation?
I guess I made the statement. I'll have a crack. I think it is. I do think it is. I've worked in the commercial side of the industry, and you've got to provide a return. And we've also, let's not forget that 12 months ago, we're in maybe a bit more, but we're in a big drought, a sustained drought that at a business level, it's sort of batten down the hatches rather than necessarily invest in new things. So we have seen and probably, the companies struggle to invest in it, and we've seen one of the things perhaps has also been about getting the expectations right between the developer and the industry and the companies there about what can be delivered over what time frame. But my observation has been that it has been a disincentive. It's not saying that there's been no investment. Don't get me wrong, it's not saying that there's been no investment, but it's saying that it hasn't necessarily been there. But the other thing to remember is that when we export grain to anywhere, that grain's come from Australia. And so whether that grain has been through a traditional bulk handling grain supply chain or from a mobile bulk loader or a combination of all of those things, is that the grain is come from Australia. It's been inspected as one thing. So getting some common systems, processes and quality assurance processes across industries important, because as a grain seller, you're selling to ports Australia. It could be SA, it could be WA, it could be both. And we need that. Therefore, we need to make sure that there is an element of coordination, and the competition in the supply chain for the receival of the grain, and through that's there, and we would encourage that, but we still need to make sure that at the end of the day there's a base level across industry and that everyone's operating at, and hopefully most people are operating above that.
Thanks everyone, and thank you everyone for joining today. It's been a really interesting day, and I think these sort of summits, if you like, or meetings, really help with our competitiveness down the track. It's really great for government to see what the industry is actually doing as a whole. I think that's really important. I've written a few notes down, so I'll get on with those. We had 167 registrations for today's meeting, which is great. And thank you for all those taking the time to listen and watch the presentations. They've all been excellent. From my point of view, I think there certainly is a mood for and an appetite, within the industry for change along the whole value chain, supply chain, whether they be structural, visual, or technological. Our industry will be the ones who must make and implement these changes. There's no doubt about that. We have to lead by example, I think. There are exciting times ahead, I think. However, funding and governmental relationships will be pivotal to ensuring we move forward from here. I think we've also had a presentation from David Ironside as a board, and also today, and I think it's fantastic to have someone like David within government who actually does understand and understands the industry and is actually really keen to make some changes to make those things a little bit more, to work a bit more smoothly within the industry. It's always great to see the Australian grain supply chain costs and container freight rates benchmarked. I know we see that just about every year from different organisations and at different conferences we have. However, it seems that we do have some problems now and in the future, and especially in the container trade, due to large imports into Australia, increased freight rates and congestion from empty containers, which we're certainly going through over here in WA. As Rosemary said, trade is becoming more difficult due to internal and external reasons. Some of those are NTMs, and GTA has certainly been on the NTM trail for quite some time now, to try and make things a little bit better as far as NTMs, and also making the trade very much aware that they are very real. GTA is certainly in a great position to facilitate added supply chain value through standards, a rules-based trading system that is well proven, risk in a self-regulatory framework that encompasses all of these things. Trade market access becomes even more important to maintaining and increasing our trade. It is pivotal to our industry to gain new markets and really to help de-risk our great products into these new and existing markets. And I think this year has been really important that some of the new markets, Mexico, India, and the like, I think have really come to the fore, and it's actually been quite good for our for our whole trade. I'll move on to the thank yous. Thank you to all our presenters for their time and expertise today. There was a great wide range of topics, but all of them coming together at the end to improve the way we might do things within the grain industry. A big thank you to Lyndall, who has admirably stepped in for Julia. Also, Pat, Tim and Erin have all done a great job setting up and running today's virtual event. As I've always mentioned, virtual does not mean easy, and there has been an enormous amount of work going on in the background, even for this smaller type conference. The GTA board has endorsed and is fully behind the From Drought Through COVID-19 to 2030 strategy, and we believe the whole grain value chain will benefit both structurally and financially from all or some of the growth pillars that we have outlined in the strategy. We hope today helps in some small way to benefiting the industry as a whole. Thanks again to all, and goodbye.